for coming. Just so you know, we will be recording, so be aware of that. I want to, to get back to thanking people, I want to thank you for coming. I realize this is a tricky time of year to try to do anything that doesn't involve grading or last end of the semester meetings. So I appreciate that. Today, we are going to be having essentially our last lecture / discussion of related programs that are tied to the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibit. The exhibit will be up until September. So if you haven't seen it, be sure to go over to Joyner Library to check it out. And perhaps once COVID restrictions get a little looser, once Roy Cooper announces what the restrictions will be, maybe things will get a little easier in terms of access to the library if you're not ECU faculty, staff, or a student. But today I wanted to have a discussion with two local filmmakers, so they're locally based, as you can imagine, based on the topic of their documentary At a Stranger's Table, which focuses on local migrant communities who are seasonal farm laborers here in Eastern North Carolina. Sally Jacobs and Scott Temple, who are essentially co-directors of the documentary, are here with us. And Sally Jacobs is a lecturer at Belmont Abbey College. She received her MFA in visual arts from Western Carolina University and her BFA from the University of Cincinnati. Her work is represented by Prince Street Gallery in New York City. She's worked as a set designer in major motion pictures and on projects such as Die Hard with a Vengeance, Ace Ventura, and The Last Dance. She's lived for 8 years in Florence, which is a fantastic place, where her work was exhibited at the Gruppo Donatello Gallery. And while in Italy, she was the recipient of the Premio Prize from Leo Fortham Studios. Her artwork can now be viewed in Faulkner Gallery at Joyner Library on the second floor of Joyner. Photographs that are featuring some of the individuals that also are included in the documentary. Scott is an instructor of English and Humanities at Pitt Community College. He has an MFA in creative writing from Sarah Lawrence College and a BA in English from App State. He's been awarded numerous grants, including the NC Humanities Large Grant, NC Regional Artist Grants, Community College National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, and Vermont Studio Center. He has walked down the Appalachian Trail, that's very cool, through the Canyonlands, stood on snow peaks of the Rockies, mountain biked the Pacific Northwest, and lived in a teepee for 4 years in Boone. He has a love for nature, and human nature is his favorite, which makes sense considering humans are the focus of our documentary and will be the focus of the discussion today. So what we're going to do is Sally and Scott will give a short talk, and then we'll open it up to larger discussion and questions. I have some questions that I have prepared, and we also want to open up for questions and discussion with the attendees. So Sally and Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Megan. That was quite nice to share all of that. I hadn't thought about some of those days for quite a while. Florence being one of them brought me right back. Thank you. And thank you also for what you're doing to bring this local issue into the national conversation around migration and bring it back home. So I really appreciate the inclusion of having this conversation. Also, thanks to Charlotte over at Joyner for including the photographs and her contribution to this conversation as well. Of course, a Mexican, we cannot give enough shout out to a Mexican for their stake in all of this. Thank you to, of course, the NC Humanities Council and, of course, Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation for the generous support on their end. So what we'd like to do, as you mentioned, Megan, is start off with a PowerPoint to just, not knowing who's in the audience, kind of give an arc of background information and topics that we learned about through the filmmaking process, and then some outcomes that came from that project. And I'm going to kind of turn it over to Scott, and he's going to crunch through a bunch, and then he'll come back and I'll crunch through a bunch, and we'll see where we land. So.
Thanks, Sally. And thank you for having me too. I appreciate this opportunity to share the documentary and just kind of the origin of this documentary. We were first-time filmmakers, and the way that this project came about was in 2016 when we first moved to Eastern North Carolina. A Mexican had an event at a church, at a local church here. And I went, and it was in response to hatred and violence shown to the Latinx community and others in the community after the election of Donald Trump. And I attended that conference, or that event, and met with Vencio, and we got into a conversation, and he asked if we'd be interested in filming a documentary to express the story of the East Coast migrant farm worker. And after we had a conversation about it, we all came to the conclusion that it would be best if the narrative came from the voice of the farm worker themselves. If we didn't have a voiceover, or we tried to allow for this film to be a voice for the migrant farm worker. And so that's what we set out to do within the film, is to allow for these narratives to come about organically. And of course, this was our first film. I don't speak Spanish, and Sally, you speak Italian. So we were piecing this together. We would never have had access to the communities without the support of a Mexican, and we wouldn't have the great translation that came about without the support of many, many interns. And so, we set out at first to introduce the H2A migrant farm worker to the US consumer, and then to also help educate about what's going on in the fields to the general public. We wanted to create empathy for the farm workers, and to create an ongoing conversation and gain public consensus. And I borrow Michelle Alexander's term there, because I believe no matter how many policies and laws, which are really important right now to have, of course, but it's the public consensus of that will bring the empathy and bring a connection and bridge between the cultures. And so I'm not too sure of our audience. I'm sure a lot of you know about the different farm workers that are out there, and the I guess the designation, but the H2A visa worker are legal workers. They come here on a visa program as a guest worker. The migrant farm worker, they're traveling from, a lot of times from Florida in early spring up the coast as the harvest comes in. And then the seasonal worker, who would be here in the region and work when there's opportunity to work with the harvest. So a lot of the workers that we worked with were the H2A visa workers, who were more transparent and willing to talk. However, a lot of the H2A workers worked alongside the migrant farm workers when those farmers needed more help in the field. They would contract out. And then, of course, the seasonal workers would come in too. And a little background on H2A. In 1986, Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, making it illegal to hire undocumented workers. I know there's a bill that just passed Congress in the House, but we'll see if it makes it through the Senate. This is through 2016. I included this because it shows a nice arc of the demand for H-2A visas up to 2016. And of course, it's grown much more since then. The US Department of State issued almost 205,000 H-2A visas in 2019. Mexicans received about 90% of those H-2A visas, followed by 3% Jamaicans, 2% Guatemalans. So you can see the predominance is within from Mexico, and that's proximity. The number of US farm jobs certified to be filled with H-2A workers remained below 100,000 in 2014, but that doubled over 2,000 in 2017 and has continued to increase. The North Carolina Growers Association, NCGA, which formed in 1989, represents 700 growers. The NCGA hires more than half of the North Carolina H-2A workers in the state. We were fortunate to have an interview with Jay Hill in 2018. And from that interview, he said in 2017, they hired between 10 and 12,000 H-2A workers amongst those 700 firms. They hired 50 to 60 domestic workers. Now realize that the law says that they first have to seek domestic help and domestic workers before they can turn to the H-2A visa program. Jay Hill said that out of those 50 and 60 domestic workers, nobody made it through the season from the domestic side. So they heavily rely on the H-2A workers within the fields. And this kind of gives you the arc here. In 2008, North Carolina was one of 6 that accounted for half of the contract or hired farm work labor, comprised largely of Latinos, of course. 2017, North Carolina was 3rd largest recruiter of guest workers after Virginia and Florida. And in 2017, Jay Hill estimated there was about 80,000 documented and undocumented field workers in North Carolina. In 2020, North Carolina was the 5th highest after Florida, Georgia, Washington, California, with about 22,000 workers. In 2020, the H-2A minimum wage in North Carolina was $12.67, up from $11.26 in 2017. Oregon and Washington have the highest, you can see $15.83, whereas Alabama, Georgia, and Florida have the lowest at $11.71. But of course, more can be harvested during the harvest season for sweet potatoes, or these crops, as farm workers race to the field, fill up their bushel bucket, carry it on uneven fields to dump it into the trailers. They'll get a coin or a scan, and they get about 50 cents per bucket. And so they have the potential of earning a lot more during that time period. However, it does depend on the health, the age, the agility of the farm worker. And Enrique here, he's 60, had been working these fields for a very long time. So his age and ability is less than other farm workers that are out there. He gathered 178 buckets, so about $89. And remember, they're out there from sunrise, around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon doing this work. Interesting story here quickly is that we would see other farm workers helping out Enrique fill his buckets. So they really look out for each other in the fields when somebody needs it. Of course, the income is unpredictable. Anytime there's rains, droughts, injuries, failed crops, anything that comes about where they can't work, they don't get paid. And therefore, poverty is high within this community. 60% of migrant and seasonal farm workers live below the poverty level. Of course, we like to address the isolation. It took a long time to find the farms, to find the locations. They move around a lot. North Carolina Growers Association, if they're part of that 700 farms, they can be moved at any time within the farms. So a new crop of, a new group of people could come to a farm, and those other people could leave and get mixed together. So sometimes it's very hard to be consistently tracking and keeping up with the farm workers. But the isolations, it's hard for them to get to communities. If they have an injury, they need a ride to a clinic. Once a week they would go get transported to a grocery store. During natural disasters, we were around for one hurricane, and they don't necessarily get moved off those farm fields, and they can be in less than desirable living conditions. So there's many different barriers that are out there associated with the isolation. This represents all the labor camps with H2A workers in North Carolina. We concentrated in this area, looking at even small amount of farms. Of course, we weren't always welcomed on every farm. We were asked to leave many times, but we are very grateful to the farmers who allowed us to interview with the workers at their field. They're not their workers, but sometimes we felt like some of the farmers felt like they were their workers. And so there's the living quarters could be any. This is an old schoolhouse that is a labor camp. You would never know it driving by the field. But there's a variety of labor camps that migrant farm workers live in. And we could get into the codes are different than a housing if we had time, but we don't have time. And we also want to bring about awareness of some of the groups that are out there. A Mexican, which is here in Greenville, which is Association of Mexicans in North Carolina. FLOC, which is Farm Labor Organization Committee. The Episcopal Farm Workers Ministry. SAF, which is Student Action with Farm Workers, and Vecinos are on the western part of the state. So there's a lot of great organizations. Oxfam report that we just had been reading about recently, so we decided to include here, follows a couple H2A workers who recruited to North Carolina, and it follows their application process and how they were promised to be reimbursed for expenses, but they were not as of that article. And it just shows the complexities that farm workers have to go through to come here to North Carolina or the states in general. And now one of the outcomes that came from our time filming was the migrant bus sculpture, and I'm going to turn that over to Sally to talk about that. Yeah, there's a lot in one.
Yeah, deep breath. I'm going to do the same, but yes, thank you for all that. Hopefully that kind of shapes a little more for questions too. So yes, this is not linear, by the way. When we set out, it was going to be just a 10-minute little introduction of the voices that we found in the fields. And then now here we are with a completely separate project called the Migrant Bus Sculpture Project. So I'm going to sort of focus on that for this last piece. But basically, when we were in the midst of filming and we were traveling throughout those regions, I kept coming back to this idea of, if we're going to talk about this story and really share the voice of the migrant farm worker, it's going to have this bus involved in some capacity, because it is everywhere you turn. The farmers themselves use them. They're super creative in how they cut these buses up and repurpose them and reconstruct them in really fascinating ways, just artistically. I was interested, but also conceptually in both how they are central to the farm workers' experience. They depend on them for transportation. They depend on them for shade. Actually, in the fields, they sit underneath the bus when they're eating lunches. They depend on them for their transporting crops, chemicals. So it just made sense that, okay, if we're gonna make this film, why not try to have the film on the bus and people would watch the film on the bus to try to continue this conversation around what this experience looks like, which is very layered and very, very complex. So that's where the premise came from. As this was growing, another series of work was growing, which was portraits of workers. And this came very organically. Workers would come up to us and ask, could we take their photo? And then from the photos, sharing them on the little screen in the fields and in our phones and whatever we had available, they started to become really interesting to document the diversity in the fields and just how richly interesting from age and location and region and geography. So they were really sort of just out there. As this kind of grew, workers were asking, could they have copies of the photographs? So then I took this challenge on, not only like taking the photographs, but then trying to locate these workers in the fields that are moved all the time, and trying to track them down so that I could print these photographs and then get them a copy. So I started taking photos of them holding their photos, and it just became a really deeper conversation with the farm workers, and we were able to have a more personal relationship with them in ways that we didn't expect. And so this was just a fun outcome of being in the fields and not knowing where this might take us. So I'll just move through these. So back to the bus, we applied for the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation grant. We were one of 20 that received an initial planning grant, and B, that this at its core is inclusive. We knew it was kind of a neat idea, but we wanted it to get into the community. The farm workers already had been on board and had been a part of this the whole time. We wanted to expand it into the greater community. So I set out to do this little maquette of a bus with some ideas on what that might look like, and then take that maquette and put it out into the community for 3 different events. One was held at Pitt Community College, the other was at Tropicana Supermarket, and then the third was at Shepherd Memorial Library. So community awareness started happening. We conducted surveys. We did some word charts and word graphs. We had tons of meetings, talked, just brainstormed. A big question mark that came from the surveys and from the questionnaires was, where were we going to house this bus if we should receive the grant? And overwhelmingly, Alice Keene Park kept coming up as the perfect spot, be that it's across from the Farmers Museum and the Pitt something or other community garden. And then of course the farmers market.
Pitt Fit Community Garden.
Yeah. So we presented, Alice Keene and I presented at the County Commissioners Board meeting, and they unanimously voted yes, which was really awesome, to permanently house the bus when it wouldn't be traveling should we receive the grant. So after the planning and sort of looking at more how this was going to shape in terms of aesthetics and location, and we received the grant. We were one of 10 in the state, and that was super exciting and overwhelming. The farm workers were the first to know, and they equally were shocked. We picked the bus off the Tarboro lot in the school surplus public bus lot, and renovations started. So throughout all of this, it was really, again, a community inclusive process. Just, gosh, carpentry, electrical, painting. And it took approximately 6 to 9 months because it was on and off with weather and just trying to figure logistics on how we're going to travel with the bus with photos on the side. And once the kind of foundation was well enough along the way. We had it out to our first community event with a school, Belvoir Elementary School, and included Greenville Montessori School as well, to kind of come together, two communities that would otherwise never overlap. And they were participating with art activities. They painted on the hood with Our Lady of Guadalupe, was starting to shape here. And it was kind of a cold day. The kids just pummeled right through it. They didn't miss a beat. They were super excited. You know, had some good coverage as well for that, and that gained some more excitement. The interior of the bus, kids had an opportunity to, at that point, we had the TV installed so they could watch and learn from the documentary. We have a library resource center on one side and an oral narrative station set up on the other side. We also have at the back of the bus what I call a creative concept studio, where students were given art supplies and opportunities to write letters to farm workers and just leave a creative expression about what they've learned. Some really neat things happened in typewriters. Kids didn't know what that was. So that was fun. They were sometimes more interested in how to work it, but nonetheless, they wrote some neat things. And then at the end, were able to leave their expression on the community board at the back of the bus. We also had some really unexpected surprises from students that were part of the Belvoir School come up and want to tell us their stories really bravely and proudly and courageously. And just, we were overwhelmed with the responses really from that event and how that impacted the greater community and the children. I even had parents of the children reach out to me thanking us for coming and giving them a voice, their children a voice. Yeah, so, yeah, so the bus somewhat is looking like this these days. And it is unfortunately at the park, residing at Alice Keene Park. It is unfortunate that we are not currently open in the inside for events due to COVID, but we do have a virtual tour that we set up, and I believe we can get that out if folks aren't aware of how to access that until we can roll on with, oh, sorry, I need to do that. So, yeah, so, yeah, so again, this was not linear at all. MFA was where I started, and I am ending with the CDL license at the tail end. So go figure. Where we head next, I don't know. So call to action, you know, our big piece in creating this conversation and kind of doing what we're doing is to get conversations going. So in that regard, that's at the core. Supporting activists, supporting advocacy groups, and at the end of the day, asking where your food comes from. Grocery stores put the little farm tags on where produce is harvested, but not necessarily who harvests our food. Education, and just thanking those that allow all of us to have sustenance at the table and feed us every day. So 23 minutes, we did good. I'm going to end on that quote, I believe, and stop sharing, I guess, right, Scott? And then we'll go back from there. I'll turn it back over to Megan.
Hey, thank you so much, you two. It's a great rundown of some of the background behind that answered a lot of questions I had as well. And I just want to note, I did put the link to the virtual tour in the chat, as well as I put the link to the Oxfam article in the chat as well. So if people want to check those out. And the bus maquette is on display at the library right now on the second floor. I forgot to mention that, along with Sally's photographs, and then a video by another artist who works mostly at the border, Susan Harbage Page. So I see we already actually have a question. I just want to start with one question and then we can kind of turn it over to the others. So the those of you saw the documentary notice that the last words that were spoken that were trans that or the last phrase in the documentary was, since the growers did not invite back the guest workers, ... And it was transposed over the family with the single mom. And I apologize if I can't remember her name. So why did you choose not to finish that thought?
To answer. You want to take it away?
Well, her name was Paula.
Paula, that's it. Okay.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
so yeah, so she is a seasonal farm worker, and
Mhm.
she was the main cook, of course,
Mhm.
of the farm, and her narrative came about as we got to know her. It was so important that we were able to tell her story. And Sally, add anything you feel like here. But what was important to us was that she fed those who were feeding the
Us.
country.
Yeah.
And to get to your point about her, is that once the farm workers didn't come back, right, she's out of
What
out of
happens?
out of a job.
Yeah, yeah.
What
She's
will
like the
happen
last
to
link.
her?
You know,
Um,
she's like this,
Mhm.
really fragile link at the end of what might be fragile for the workers, but then how does that spiral back out into those
Mhm.
that are here year round?
That's a broader,
Wow.
so just not having them here is important for producing our food, but having them here is sort of a broader element of our local commerce, I guess, in a way, right? I mean,
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
some
not only
well,
employing people, but I mean, in a sense that she was employed, got
right,
paid, but then she was
right.
feeding funds into the community, by buying supplies and
paying
yeah,
taxes.
paying
Yeah.
taxes.
That's right, and being part of this community, and
Mhm.
having to then find another job with a single mom with children.
Yeah.
Right.
Was
And
she able to? Do you know? Did you follow
yes,
her
yes, she
story?
does. And we have, made a really deep friendship with her, and it has been very, very hard. Her preference would be in the fields to help and cook. That's where she could really earn a much better wage for herself. But she works undocumented in a restaurant as a food prep.
Mm-hmm.
So among other things, to make ends meet. So it's been really hard for her because she isn't able to bring her children. She would be able to bring her children to the job site prior.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of impact that's happened with the children as well because of it. So
Yeah, I can
um,
imagine.
yeah,
Well, and then with COVID on top of everything, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's
don't
just
even.
Yeah,
yeah.
so all this was before COVID.
Yeah, I mean,
So
COVID
COVID would have
is
complicated
COVID
it.
is its
Yeah.
own beast. Yeah, that layered in here for sure.
Yeah.
So it's been really tough for her.
Oh, I can imagine. Are there, I mean, are there ways that people can, I know Mexican is really involved in helping these communities. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people attending who saw the documentary are wondering what they can do. Are there, donation centers for, I don't know, clothing? I know I see that every once in a while. Is there a place to donate to help support the workers? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, there are. I mean, we listed like Flock and SAF, Student Action Farm Workers.
Mhm.
So I know if students want to get involved, they can do internships with organizations like that. Flock is Farm Labor Organizing Committee.
And
A
the
Mexican
Mexicans always-
their Mexican is there right here locally. So, I mean, there's a host of places where you can get involved in, depending on your time and talents and resources.
Mhm.
Anything and everything can be of help. And
Mhm.
at the
You
end
can
of the
drop off
day,
clothes at a
yeah, you
Mexican.
can drop it off clothes. They do a long sleeve drive. I mean, finding.
Mhm.
So a
Yes.
lot of the things
Yeah.
that they have to do also, which is in that article, is they have to pay some of them for their clothing. They don't always get the proper gear and
Mhm.
equipment needed to do the work in
Especially
the fields.
shoes, that's the big one, I'm
With
sure.
shoes or just safety
Mhm.
things, with gloves and hats for the sun and water bottles. Like water bottles is a really big thing that they have
Mhm.
access to water. And so if anyone's interested, we can certainly point people
Mhm.
specifically in a direction, but I don't even know where to anything. And really, also an important piece to this is in the grocery store, like I said, the more we can bring consumer awareness around who harvests our food at that level, because that's where a lot of power lies,
Mhm.
is
The consumer.
yeah, and fair wages, right? Fair wages.
Mhm.
And we care about where our food comes from, but not necessarily
Mhm.
where and who
Yeah.
picks it.
So Sonia has a question. This is actually a similar question that I had as well, is sort of the infrastructure behind bringing like contracted laborers to the US. I assume that those are the ones who are on then the H2A visas. So do they get paid travel expenses to come to Eastern North Carolina from wherever they are? Do they travel by bus? Do they sort of get the travel paid, but then are expected to pay it back with their wages? How does that sort of
Yeah, it's
financially work?
super complicated.
Well,
Yeah.
there's
if
two-
they go through the North Carolina Growers Association, which I know they've had their turbulence and ups and downs, and you can research that on your own. But they, with our interview, they explained that they reimburse the workers for coming up in their travel. Okay, and they're contracted with those 700 farms, at least in 2018. That's how many farms they had, and those farms could share
workers.
the workers between the farms. So if somebody's crops fail, those workers can be transported to another field or vice versa. Whereas if you're outside in the North Carolina Growers Association, they are only allowed to work at that one field. Okay, so if it was an independent farmer, so that Oxfam article probably addresses, I'm not 100% sure, but it sounds like they were independent farmer, brought in the H2A worker, probably didn't pay the reimbursement like they're supposed to, and a whole list of things.
Yeah.
If they're outside of that North Carolina Growers Association too, and they get transferred to another firm, that is labor trafficking. And there's been cases of that too.
Okay.
Not human trafficking, but labor trafficking, where they were contracted to work at a specific spot, but were moved to another location where they're not
another
supposed
job
to.
that they didn't necessarily know about or sign up for. But back to your point too, in that, how are they included in those fees when they're coming? Workers in the sending communities aren't always clear, and that's part of where the breakdown happens, right?
Yeah.
A hired contractor will say, I'm going to cover these expenses because your employer on the receiving end is going to reimburse you for those so that I can get paid. And then when that actually starts to unfold and they get here, the employers, be a small independent farmer, says, I didn't agree to that, and you're still, stuck with the bill.
Yeah.
Or it might be through the H2A program, like Scott was mentioning with the Growers Association, and it is covered and it is incurred, but each farm has different regulations and expectations on what they will cover.
Yeah.
So
That is really complicated.
it's very complicated.
Yeah.
It gets even more complicated if they're undocumented and they're coming and they have paid a coyote to get here, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Then we have another.
Yeah. Somebody asked, is the North Carolina Growers Association fair to the workers, or are they biased towards the owners?
Yeah, well, they're
You'd have
named
to ask the workers, right?
Yeah.
And so the workers share their feelings about it, and
in the documentary they spoke about it a little bit of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you could sense that there wasn't, they weren't too enthusiastic.
They're set up to advocate for the growers.
Mm-hmm.
That's who their client base is.
Yeah.
And then tearing down from that are the necessity of the worker to the farmer. So there's, a removed set of interests. However, it just depends on the farm. It's not really a black and white issue. I think one thing we have learned for sure is we're not quick to throw any one particular person or organization under the bus. It's everyone is trying to jockey and align and find that sweet spot for how they can continue harvesting, how they can continue industry to supply us with cheap food. And the worker is very much the biggest concern that a farmer has to deal with is labor.
Is labor.
Is labor. So
I mean, the farmer, the grower is crunched too.
Yeah.
Right. The whole system is compressed, and who's at the bottom is the laborer.
So if anyone else has any questions, I think you can unmute yourself or put your question in the chat. I mean, there are some more questions still. I have some more questions, but if you want to speak up yourself and not put it in the chat, just raise your hand. Or if you want to just put it in the chat, I'll read out the question. Somebody asks if the farms have provided COVID vaccines for workers. I know a Mexican was involved in that, but
spreading the word and and seeing if there's, there is a big need for transportation from the farms to clinics. That's a huge one.
Mobile clinics,
and I
like
think,
Vecinos does that.
Yeah.
On the western part of the state, they're working really heavily with.
There's a lot of
mobile
advocates
clinics
out there for that.
So
again, it comes back down to the farm and the farm owner.
The resources and how vested they are in providing full care for the worker. Some of the bigger farms, of course, they're tracked with scan card codes on their hat. They're just
that's interesting.
Yeah, and so in the couple of the photos at ECU have the worker with the tag on their hat to track each bucket, and that's how their pay system is tracked. So they don't actually get a physical token. So it's a way for them to create a payroll and to create accuracy in what they've harvested. But also it sort of, spirals into things like this with medical care and how that's linked to their greater system as in how the farm, organizes healthcare, which, some of the big farms do. They have the means and the capacity to bring in
Because
clinics.
they don't want their workers to get sick either.
But some of the smaller farms don't, they leave it on the worker to figure it out, and if you can get there, great. If not, no big deal. And that's the case if they get sick, if you can't make it in, you can't make it in. Oh, well, you just miss your day of wages and you got to sweat it out. Yeah. So they don't provide a whole lot of assistance. So we've seen good and bad and big and small, and they're all different for sure.
Yeah, it is. Is this, so there seems to be, there's this balance that people are trying to have between keeping costs low and yet not, I guess, completely exploiting people or having people who are willing to travel here to work for wages that, in general are going to be more than they earn maybe back home, but still are, they still have struggled to sustain their life here as well while they're actually working on the farm. So and farming is changing a lot here, right? The crops that people are growing is changing. Do you think that there's like a focus on less labor intensive crops to try to sort of salvage, the survivorship of the farm? I mean, to salvage farms so that they are, don't have to pay for a lot of labor. I guess that makes sense.
That's part of what happened.
That's part of what happened. They went to less labor intensive crop, the machine crop, and they cut out the workforce, and they don't have to bring in that labor force to
consider
support. That's the number one. That's the highest
output that they have.
Yeah,
is labor.
expense they have is labor. So if they can keep the labor costs low,
Or
you know,
or none,
or none, right?
then it might be a matter of survival for that farm.
For that farm.
Which
it's-
is what happened to the one farm that we
Yeah,
went to.
apparently.
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah,
What
apparently,
they
yeah.
shared, but I think another key thing here too, Megan, is labor control versus this whole neoliberal kind of construct of how workers, there's an argument to be made out there that they're getting paid really well because they can take that dollar and it goes that much further in Mexico, right? So that's a narrative that we hear all the
Oh,
time.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right. So it's a labor control is the bigger issue here,
Mhm.
right? Like, why do we say it's okay, to treat people this way and to have a job that is providing the world with food for our benefit, and have it so boxed and inhumane, really,
Mhm.
for our benefit, regardless of whether you think they're paid well or not, because as
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can
it
see,
doesn't matter.
minimum wage in each state is very different, and that's not a mandatory thing. Every state has an opportunity to put their wage wherever they want, right?
Mhm.
Which is where some of the discrepancy goes. So it's more a labor control.
And what employer wouldn't like to have a labor force that's housed in one spot, gets picked up at a certain time, brought to the fields. There's no flat tires. There's no, hey, my kids are sick. I want this weekend off. Oh, I want holidays. My kid has a soccer game, whatever. I woke up, if they wake up sick, they don't go in, they stay there, they get picked up the next day. But it's a complete control of that labor.
Mhm.
And I don't think domestic workers are going to say, hey, it's fine, to come by my house, pick me up, and, and I would be expected to be on call like that without
Mhm.
any type of say so within it, or the work
Yeah.
conditions too. So
Yeah, for sure. So how did you choose which of the non-migrant individuals, so the US citizens, which to include in the documentary? How did you know these individuals from before? Like, what compelling story did you think they had that sort of added to it? Or was it just chance?
What was it?
we had a process of grocery stores that we were.
Oh, you mean for the non-US consumer?
Yeah. So,
You're not the workers. You're asking about the
Yeah, the US citizens
Yeah.
who were part of the dinner and
Yeah, we just started at the grocery stores. And we
interviewing
just
people
started
as they were
asking
leaving.
people, do you know where your food's harvested from? And would you want to talk to us? And so they would look and be like, I'm busy, gotta go see my kid, I don't know what you guys are doing. And we would sneak in all different kinds of lots, like undercover. And then we asked if they would be interested in learning more about the project and what we were doing, and does this interest you in some capacity? And we got everything from get out of here to, yeah, you should get my number and my email. And so it just kind of grew the list. And then we started talking, more specifically as we were getting closer to filming that scene. And that's what we kind of landed with was, the spectrum of age and gender.
some are involved, and some are involved in farming themselves, and
Yes.
that was kind of interesting as well.
Yeah.
I think it ended up being kind of a nice variety of
Mhm.
voices and people that it's not a monolith
Mhm. No, of course
any more
not.
than the other side of the table
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
How did you decide to have, so I guess with a meal, you could have had one of the US citizens host the meal and have it be at one of their places or a neutral place, right? But what made you decide to have it at the labor camp? and be
Yeah.
essentially hosted by the laborers, but since their cook did cook, I mean, their cook, then since Bala did cook all of the food at the end, at the meal.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, so couple things. You know, we wanted, because one of our main ideas was to introduce the farm workers to consumers. You know, this was on where they worked, where they lived, right?
Mhm.
And so it's on their turf, and we wanted to make sure that the farm workers felt safe, and
Mhm.
that they had a comfort, and
And
you know,
nobody
and
comes to
so
visit them.
yeah, nobody. I think it's really
I know.
special for somebody
know?
to come out to them, right? They did have farmers that would host some
Like end of
gratitude
the
end of the
year, end
year
of the
meal
harvest meal at a restaurant.
at a
Some
restaurant,
of them would
different
do
things.
that.
Mhm.
And so they would come into that capacity once
Mhm.
every 6 to 9 months. But they kept saying, you know, we don't a lot of the times know where we even are.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
we don't know the name of the road.
No.
We don't know the name of the camp. We don't really have
Do
any
we even
sense of-
have, I mean, some of them, I've been out there, some of them don't really have names.
don't have names.
Yeah.
And so nobody knows, you know,
Yeah.
nobody even knows that they're behind these
Mhm.
forested lines of trees and,
Yeah, exactly.
you know, tucked into like things that a schoolhouse where you'd never expect workers to be.
Mhm.
So part of it was bringing that consumer into that space so that there was an awareness from the consumer on, you know, this is where they live, right? From that aspect, and also to make it as comfortable for the workers as well. 25 years, one worker had been coming and never has had a conversation
Mhm.
with anyone outside of the farmer,
Mhm.
right? And so he was very, very nervous to do this, right? So,
Mhm.
so
Yeah, it
that,
kind of, it equalizes sort of a power differential in a way to, you imagine if they were going to, especially if somebody was wealthy, I mean, a lot of us would be, nervous about going to have, dinner and which fork do I use and
Right.
whatever. And,
Right.
especially if you're from another culture, which, I've been in that situation a lot, and it can be stressful.
Yeah.
I mean,
yes,
so
Social
yeah, and you can
capital.
see when they were getting ready and like, is this okay? Do I, I'm nervous about this. So
yes.
And we
yeah.
also wanted the people who came to them as citizens here in the Greenville area to, there's a lot of social capital that they bring too, right?
Yeah.
Because of their status as,
Mm-hmm.
US citizens, and, different, they're driving up in cars, you see
Mm-hmm.
some of that there. And, this, like you said, it does equalize it. It's on their turf. And
Mm-hmm.
and then when they were all at the table, it was interesting to see how they negotiated the language. And how
Yeah,
they
I was
negotiated.
wondering how that was going to happen, because there was one guy who spoke pretty good Spanish, and a couple guys who spoke pretty decent English, or at least a little bit, but
It was minimal, yeah.
Yeah.
it
And
was pretty
you
minimal.
know, we did not they knew ahead, of course, we're gonna have this dinner, but we did not script anything. Or
Mhm.
I said to Scott and Scott to me, what will be, in that, if there's discomfort, then there's gonna be, that is, gonna manifest. If there's
Mhm.
frustration, we're gonna have translators there, but we can't make this be any more than what it's going to be naturally. So,
And just technically, that was a very hard part of filming,
Yeah.
because we had all these mics and we had to find in the editing. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you probably noticed that on the film. But yeah, it was different camera angles and trying to keep the
and
cameras
we're
I mean, there's
first
a lot.
timers, right?
There's a
And we're
lot
like,
going- there was a lot going on in that
"What?"
scene.
And, we're just like, what? I didn't sign up for.
Yeah, well, you did a great job. I mean, there were some
I mean,
great
it was
shots that were-
certainly, yeah. I said, let's
yeah.
cross the
make it
finish
good.
line. We crossed the finish line, and right before COVID, so we were really lucky because,
Yeah, thank
oh
goodness.
my God,
Exactly.
a lot of the guys weren't invited back, and it just would have gotten.
Yeah, that's what, yeah. For sure. I mean, and it was great that you had food involved, because that's also always one of those things that sort of, breaks
Mind.
any barriers. I mean,
Yes.
I've many times have been at tables where I don't speak the same language as anyone else, but you're able to sort of
Make it work.
make it work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in the food, I think I see a little chat box, somebody saying, did Paula cook all the food? Yes,
Yeah.
she did. She
Yeah.
planned everything. She asked the guys what they wanted. They were like, peixe, peixe. They wanted the fish for sure.
Which
They
looked
wanted the
really
whole
good.
fish, and they wanted the head, just like, they would
Mhm.
find in their home villages. And, we knew that would be difficult for
Mhm.
her and for the filming scene. But when that came out, we noticed that the US consumer side were like, what are we going to do with that fish? And
this
so
guy
nobody
staring
ate
at us.
the fish.
Some of them
really?
did.
Some of them did,
but if you
Why would they
notice,
eat the fish?
but they were super intimidated on
Some of them,
how
not
they
all
were
of them,
gonna.
yeah.
They'd never eaten or seen a whole fish on the plate, right?
Oh, do
Just
you think
fried
like here
like
in
that.
Eastern
They
North
were
Carolina, like people
out.
fish a lot? I don't
Oh,
know.
but it's usually filleted and the head's off and it's skinned, and they were like,
Oh boy, well,
why
that's
do I do this? So we
disappointing.
had a little, I felt really, there was a moment I was just, my heart was so heavy for Paula, because I know she was wanting
Looking.
everybody to just dig in
Oh.
and have this wonderful thing. And people were like, not doing it, I'm
Oh
not
my
gonna
God,
eat it.
because it looks so good.
It was just
Anyway.
delicious. So, but we had to let it roll, because
Yeah.
that's
We
part
did.
of the cultural disconnect,
Yeah, exactly.
and the divide, and
Yeah.
how people are really disconnected to their food source, and the fact that it has a head and eyes and it's living.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. So somebody asked about the North Carolina Growers Association and how they inspect the housing. So is there and in the documentary, you could tell there was, and in the pictures you showed, there's a big difference in terms of the infrastructure for these camps. So what are the standards they use? I mean, are they pretty
Yeah.
low, or
You
do
can
some
talk about
houses
that.
not meet standards?
Right.
Yeah,
So the North Carolina, basically the labor law on housing with this, it's called a labor camp because it doesn't follow the same guidelines as a house, right?
Okay.
So it's a camp, right? And when you think about a camp, minimum facilities can be involved there.
they're actually
They do inspect them at the beginning
Mhm.
of
every season.
every season before the workers get there.
And they put a maximum.
They have a maximum capacity
Sticker.
per housing. They need to have a certain amount of bathrooms per workers. They need to have
Certain amount of beds, certain
water,
amount of
right?
refrigeration.
Fire extinguishers, fire
Extinguishers,
yes,
water, and
yes.
things of that nature.
They don't have to provide heat and air,
The problem is that they don't come back again to re-inspect.
right?
Yeah.
And also they, if they pass, I believe after 3 years, they get
A gold
a
star.
gold star, and they
Then
can
they're
do
not-
self-inspection.
Yeah.
The farmer can
Farmer
do,
can
the
do
grower can-
self-inspection. Yeah.
Mhm.
And they're called temporary dwelling units. They're not
Mhm.
called housing.
Mhm.
So that also falls under a whole different set of rules and regulations. If they're temporary dwelling units, then they don't have to provide the same kinds of things that
Mhm.
housing that you and I think of would have to have, right?
Mhm.
So they can pack them in.
Well, what happens is that as the growing season goes and the demand goes up, more workers come to that farm.
Mhm.
They need the space. So
So
they
over-
might start with the right amount,
Okay.
or even less.
But because there's no,
Then they get more and more full.
right. Yeah. So
Do they have any, does the North Carolina Growers Association have anything to do with health and safety? Like, are there any, so, I mean, in archaeology in Jordan, which, also is like this sketchy day labor situation, and, you try to do it so you're not exploiting people. But, we do actually have to have health insurance for the people employed, even if they're day laborers. So, I mean,
Yeah,
Yep,
that's a
Affordable
great.
Care Act.
Yeah, they're eligible. I mean, they pay taxes. These are withheld in their checks. So
Mhm.
they are entitled to the Affordable Care Act.
Okay. But
Yes.
that's
That's
still,
for H2A.
yeah.
For H2A.
So
But most
there's-
of them don't.
Access
Sees
East
it.
was one of the groups that would go out and sign them. It's a huge
Yeah,
process because
it's
they got to find them, sign them
again,
up,
Yeah.
and there's a penalty
paperwork.
if they
Mhm.
don't
terminate.
before they leave.
Yes.
Then they get penalized. So
Yes, which we had that happen with several. They said, "Oh no, we are not doing healthcare. No, no."
Oh, wow.
that's
you know.
what happened to Eric in the documentary. He terminated his
Mhm.
ACA,
Before
Then got
he
the ear
left, then he got
infection.
sick,
and he
Mhm.
and he
still
wasn't covered.
he wasn't covered.
Yeah.
Right, because he was so afraid, and they don't always know when they're
Yeah.
going to be sent either. They give them a tentative date. You know, you're going to
Yeah,
be.
yeah.
So there's all this vicariousness on
Wow.
what they provide, but a lot of them we talked to just didn't sign up for it because
You still are paying
they're
a
just
monthly pay.
yeah, and they don't want to really. They're afraid
Yeah,
to
yeah.
get into the hospital system. They
Yeah.
they don't know if they're going to have translators, the languages barriers.
And we got texts from some of the workers saying, I'm not feeling well. Can I get a ride?
Yeah, so we would
Yeah,
take,
well, that's what access is a big problem.
Yeah, and so we take them in or find a way for them to get there to the clinic. But a lot of the times, I mean, they're not going to really ask their boss to get transported to the clinic
just
because
sweat it out. A lot of
yeah,
them
and
do.
there's some pride there too that
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, so there was somebody asked about the gentleman who left and got a security job in Mexico.
no way.
Yeah, no way. Yeah.
Yeah, no way. That's it. What's the comparison? I mean, if like in terms of the pay of what he'd get doing that versus
Ooh.
working as a
I don't,
farmer.
Yeah.
know. I don't,
I don't. It was
wouldn't either.
difficult. I know that his wife was getting her certification to teach elementary school, lower level, and so he was not making enough to support his family at that job for sure. That had been very
Yeah.
well documented to
Mhm.
us, and so so part of, I think there was a question there about the music, like I'm kind of going in this trajectory because
Yeah. The
you
music
brought
was
that up.
very upbeat.
yeah, and so I'm touching on that because not everything is doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Workers want to be here. They want to come because they depend on this remittance money to build this better life for their families in their home countries. I mean, that is why they make these sacrifices. So they are, they want to be here. It provides a lot of sustenance for them for the remaining months out of the year to their family. A lot of them have put their children through college and professional trainings and workshops. And we had so many success stories of this country has given me and my family, an immense amount of opportunity. And everywhere we turned, we would hear that gratitude. Really.
Like Noe was, he was
So,
a happy guy.
He was really happy.
Same with some of the other narratives are on there. They're talking about their children going to school and so I think that it's a sacrifice to come here.
Yes.
And it speaks a lot about the isolation, right? That is the biggest sacrifice. That is the biggest isolation that they have because they're separate. And it's not just missing big events like Noe and the death of his father. It's missing the everyday things, they say, like waking your child up to go to school, seeing them come home, or just having a meal with their family.
And Enrique had the child who had cancer, and he, there was a complexity there with him, and he missed. He added up from the time he started this profession until now, and it was like 13 years he missed out of his son's life. If you added all the months he was here over the course of his career, right? And he has no pension, he has no, security from one year to the next. all he has is those days and months where he actually is making a wage that translates something better for him and his family and his country,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah. There was one other question. No, I can't. Oh, so what's going on now with COVID and you know, I know it wasn't really obviously the documentary predates this, but have people not been able to come back across the border? I mean, you know, I'm trying to remember. I spent the fall in Arizona but I don't remember like hearing about, you know, there's a lower number of people coming across. I know for a while the border was closed, you know, the official crossings.
I think the exemption for H2A and
Okay.
H2B workers were there. I think they were exempt, but
mhm.
I know we didn't really,
Yeah, I mean,
can't
it
really
wasn't
speak
focused,
upon
but
that.
Yeah.
But I know they were still coming. Maybe there is more reluctance, I can imagine, from workers,
Mhm.
but I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I wanted to thank you. It's already after 5. So, this has been a really fantastic discussion. Getting a lot of thank yous in the chat and some other interesting comments. And I want to thank people too for joining us and for your questions and comments as well. It's been wonderful, and you know, hopefully we'll be able to you know, make this kind of connection happen in the future as well. So I really appreciate it, and yeah, thank you for making this documentary and having us show it, and it just goes along so well. And so be sure to people to check out Sally's art at Joyner on the 2nd floor, the maquette of the bus, and the photographs.
And please reach out to us if you have any other questions too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
And thank you.
Keep the conversation going. So thank you,
Yeah,
Megan, again. We appreciate it
definitely.
very,
Yeah.
very much.
All right. Thanks. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.